Good evening. In talking with my children and grandchildren, I'll often tell them that Jews are like bumblebees. The bumblebee, by all laws of nature, should not be able to fly, its body weight being far too great to be supported by its gossamer wings. But by flying, it defies all odds. The analogy to the Jewish people is obvious. Despite centuries of persecution and isolation, despite the attempts of many societies to eradicate them, Jews have survived and continue to flourish as a people. And that is because of organizations like the Endowment for Middle East Truth and dedicated truth tellers like Charles Krauthammer. Even before I knew Charles personally, I was one of his many fans. I was a long-time reader of his column, and we were acquaintances through the synagogue and our children's and grandchildren's schools. But one of the unexpected benefits and true joys of owning a baseball team has been the opportunity to get to know Charles personally and to call him a friend. Charles is a true baseball fan. As a kid growing up in Montreal, he would hide his transistor radio under his pillow to listen to the New York Yankees games. Now that he's allowed to stay up a little later, he rarely misses a game. He can tell you that as long as the winds are fair and the 3rd Street tunnel is clear, it takes exactly 7 minutes to get from the Fox News to the ballpark. Charles has said during baseball season, he only gives the front page of the morning newspaper about 90 seconds before turning right to the box scores. Our pal George Will replied, "Why waste the 90 seconds?" Charles and his love of the game are a reminder that baseball is much more than a sport. Especially in Washington, it's a chance to break from politics. For those 9 innings, the only right and left that matters is how you bat, how you throw, and stay in between the foul lines. Of course, Charles has distinguished himself as much more than a just great baseball fan. It's been said that Mo Berg, the famous catcher who went on to become a spy for the United States, could speak 7 languages but couldn't hit in any. Charles, on the other hand, is what we call a 5-tool player, one of those rare men who can do it all. Just the fact that he's a Harvard-educated doctor would have been enough to make any Jewish mother proud. But for Charles, that was only the beginning. He's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a syndicated Washington Post columnist, a best-selling author, a Fox News commentator, and a powerful voice on the Middle East. He and his wife, Robin, have resurrected Jewish classical music in concert halls across the country. And how many people can say they have driven from Washington to New York for a chess match? Twice. I could go on, but Charles is hoping to make it out of here in time to catch at least some of tonight's game against the Astros. So let's just say that while he holds many titles, Charles is above all a proud American and an unwavering ally of Israel. There is no one who has brought more conviction and clarity to the conversation about the strength of our 2 nations. For all of this reason, there is no one more fitting to honor here tonight as Speaker of Truth than the man I'm proud to call my good friend, Charles Krauthammer.
Thank you, Ted, for that lovely introduction. It is truly an honor to be introduced by such a great American, great benefactor, and extraordinary Jew. I'm happy to be here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. When I hear an introduction like that, I feel that there really are two kinds of introductions. There are the nice introductions and there are the kind introductions. A nice introduction is where they list everything you've done. They get it transcribed and notarized and they send your mother a copy. A kind introduction is where they leave stuff out. Ted very kindly left out, at least from my perspective, the fact that I was once a speechwriter for Walter Mondale. I just want to let that settle in for a second. So naturally, people ask me, how do you go from Walter Mondale to Fox News? And I tell them it really is very simple. I was young once. I think I've just offended half the people in the room, so I apologize. You rather unkindly left in the fact that I was once a psychiatrist. In fact, technically speaking, I still am a psychiatrist, still licensed, but truth be told, I'm a psychiatrist in remission. Doing very well, thank you. Haven't had a relapse in 25 years. And of course, I'm asked to compare what I do today in Washington as a political analyst with what I used to do in Boston as a psychiatrist, and I tell people that it really isn't that different. Don't get ahead of me now. In both lines of work, I deal every day with people who suffer from paranoia and delusions of grandeur. The only difference is that the paranoids in Washington have access to nuclear weapons. Makes the work a little more interesting. I really am happy and honored to be here today, honored to get your award. Delighted to be among people who are truly doing God's work. But truth be told, I'm happy to be anywhere where Juan Williams can't interrupt me. I'm particularly honored by the fact that your organization is named after and stands for truth. EMET. Truth is not a very popular word among sophisticated circles these days. Truth is supposed to be relative, truth is supposed to be elastic, truth is supposed to be in the eye of the beholder. Everybody has their truth, it is said, particularly in the academy. Everybody has their story, but today you don't use the word story, you say narrative, so you sound sophisticated. Everybody has their narrative. There's the Jewish narrative, there's the Arab narrative, there's the Hamas narrative, they're all narratives. This is rubbish. When it comes to the Middle East, there is history and there are facts. There is truth and there are lies. And there is nothing relative, nothing elastic about three fundamental truths about the Middle East, all of which I know many of you in this organization devote so many hours and so much of your life to defending. The first truth is, the undeniable first truth is, that the Jewish people have the right to a sovereign state, independent and free. It's not just a moral right. It's not just a legal right, the Balfour Declaration, the Charter of the League of Nations, the UN resolution, partition resolution of 1947, establishing a Jewish state. It is also a right that derives from sacrifice. The Jews of Israel have fought and died for this independent sovereign state. I remember a famous dove in Israel, I believe it was A.B. Yehoshua, who was willing to give back just about everything for peace. But he drew the line in one place. He said the Palestinian right to return, meaning the right to undo the war of 1948, which the Arabs started not over settlements, not over occupation, but over the very existence of a Jewish state. You want the right of return? Fine. I'll give you the right of return. I'll give you the reversal of the 1948 war. When you give me back the 6,000 Jews of the Yishuv who were killed in that war, at that point, when you revive them and you bring them back to life, I will be willing to undo the War of Independence. The fact is that in the War of Independence, by losing 6,000 Jews out of a Yishuv population of 600,000, the Jews of Israel lost 1% of that population. That is an astonishing total. Translated into American terms, that would mean 3 million dead. The Vietnam War cost 55,000 dead. That would mean 60 Vietnam memorials spread around the mall to capture the magnitude of the loss, the sacrifice, the heroism of the Jews who fought to establish a state. And they fought again and again. And they fought ultimately for the historic right. You should all make sure that your children one day read the Declaration of Independence issued by the Jews on May 15, 1948 in Israel, explaining, like the American Declaration of Independence, the basis and the principles on which Israel is found. And the fundamental principle is the historic right of the Jewish people to return to their homeland. When you go to campus today, you hear about apartheid. You hear about Israeli colonialism. You hear about occupation. And of course, when people talk about this, they are playing on the ignorance of the young people. They play on the supposed analogy and equivalence between, say, the Westerners who settled in America, in Canada, in New Zealand, in South Africa, in many other places. And they say similarly the European Jews descended upon a land that belonged to others and took it over. The fundamental misperception, the fundamental untruth underlying all of this is that all these other Western colonialists were coming to lands they had no connection with, had never heard of, had never set foot on. The Jews were returning home. And the reason the world often denies this or refuses to accept this is because of the uniqueness of this in all of human history. No people have ever been exiled for 2,000 years and come home. No people have ever been exiled for 2,000 years and survived. The story of all peoples is that you are conquered, you're assimilated, you're enslaved, you're dispersed, and you disappear. We can't even read the language of the Etruscans. What happened when Carthage was destroyed? It disappeared. All the other peoples of the Middle East who were conquered disappeared. Even the 10 tribes disappeared. But the Jews never disappeared. They are the only people who maintain their identity through 2,000 years of exile. This has never happened in human history, and the uniqueness is such that people cannot really understand it or accept it. And not only did the Jews survive, the Jews never gave up their longing for return. Never. You read the Shemona Esrei, which are the main prayer of all the 3 prayers of the day, the morning, afternoon, evening prayer. It stands for 18. There are 18 blessings in the Shemona Esrei. This is said 3 times a day by Jews. And I'm always struck when I read it by the fact that more than half of the blessings have to do with longing for Zion, longing for return, longing for the ingathering of the exiles, longing for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. This is a people that for one day, for half a day, never gave up their claim to the land from which they had been forcibly expelled. They maintained a continuous occupation, and they maintained a historic claim which remains undeniable and irrefutable. It is a travesty that when people talk about Israel, they speak about a foreign occupation, and they pretend they created a whole new history. This is the new narrative, that the Palestinians are the original inhabitants of the land. The word Palestine didn't even exist until 132 AD, when Hadrian destroyed for the second time the Jewish Commonwealth, razed Jerusalem, enslaved and exiled the population, and renamed it precisely after the name of the Philistines and their enemies as a way to eradicate the memory of Judea, which was the Jewish state of the time. That was an invention. You dig anywhere in Israel for anything, a road, a house, an orchard, and what will you find? Coins from the Bar Kokhba rebellion, year 1 of the Jewish Commonwealth, year 2. The history of the Jews in the land is undeniable, and the fact that so many people around the world are continuing to deny this fact is a scandal, and one of the things that you do is to make sure people know about this history and see it embodied in your work. The historic right of the Jewish people is the foundation of the claim to the land. That's the first truth that is denied scandalously. The second truth is that the Jews have always been willing to compromise in the name of peace, while the Arabs have rejected every overture for almost 100 years. In an audience like this, I don't have to elaborate, but we just have to go back to the Partition Resolution of 1947, to the offers Israel was prepared to make in 1967, to the Camp David Accords of 1979, which spoke about Palestinian autonomy and then negotiations for a further stage. And then, of course, we have the Oslo Accords, the offer, astonishingly generous offer by Ehud Barak at Camp David in 2000, at Taba in 2001, and even a more astonishing offer by Ehud Olmert in 2008, from which, as in every other time, Mahmoud Abbas, like everyone he succeeded, going back to Haj Hamid al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinians at the time of the Second World War, to which they walked out and said no. And you all know the 3 no's of Khartoum, 1968, no negotiation, no recognition, no peace, ever. That has not changed. Oslo was a lie and a deception. The supposed... I was on the White House lawn that day when it was signed. I remember seeing people around me weeping with joy that the peace had arrived. I was so dismayed, I was heartbroken. All you had to do was to listen to Yasser Arafat's speech that day. He spoke not of reconciliation. He spoke not of peace. He spoke of success and triumph. And that very night he made a speech on Jordanian television in which he explained that the Oslo Accords was simply part of the phase plan, the plan the Palestinians had agreed upon 20 years earlier to reconquer the land and expel the Jews and destroy Israel, but not in one swoop because they knew they couldn't do it, but in phases. And the first phase, acquire any foothold in Palestine from which to continue to wage the war. That was so clear from the first day. There was never any intention. And even to this day, with the preposterous negotiations that this administration conducted in the face of every indication that there was no Palestinian partner for peace, even to this day, Mahmoud Abbas, whose wife, incidentally, had her knee replaced in a hospital in Tel Aviv last week, so much for apartheid, Mahmoud Abbas refuses to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And our Secretary of State says, oh, this is not an important issue. We all know what we're talking about with Israel. We don't. The Palestinian idea is to recognize a state called Israel, to flood it with Palestinian refugees because they will not give up the right of return. And then you simply have a state with a certain name, you change the name, you change the democracy, and you make it a 23rd Arab state. The acceptance of Israel as a Jewish state is the heart, the foundation, the essence of the conflict. And to this day, despite all the pretenses, all the ruses, all the pretenses that the world has accepted, the Palestinians refuse to do it. Which brings us to the last truth. The last truth is this. People talk about the Middle East conflict as very complicated, very nuanced, and yes, at the edges and the details there are curlicues that can be complicated. But it is one of the simplest questions in history. There is a single truth about the Middle East conflict. On the day the Arabs and the Palestinians accept the legitimacy and the existence of a Jewish state, the conflict will be over within a month. But until that day, so long as the Palestinians and the Arabs maintain a centuries-long refusal to accept a Jewish state, there will be no peace. One of the great and tragic things about our own history is that we forget that truth. We are so hungry for peace, and one can understand that for every Israeli who has to suffer through all the wars, has to send their children away to battle, not knowing if they will return. This can be a terribly oppressive truth, which led them to the catastrophe of Oslo. The problem with Oslo is that it legitimized the so-called Palestinian narrative of Israeli colonialism while delegitimizing the Jewish claim to the land. That was the fundamental error, apart from all the stuff on the ground, giving Arafat control of the West Bank, arming him, all that. But the fundamental error and the harm it did to Israel's cause and Israel's case was undermining what is called now the Israeli narrative, but what you and I know is the truth, which is the right of the Jews to the land and the fact that they have always offered to compromise. And that has been a legacy which you now have to fight all the more. As long as there's no recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, there will always be conflict. And on the day the other side accepts a Jewish state, then you've turned an existential dispute into a territorial one. Territorial disputes are solvable. Existential disputes are not. They can only end with the destruction of one side. And the Jews will not allow that. I'll add one more thing about this, how difficult it is for Americans to understand the essence of the conflict. And one of the reasons is that we live in a kind of splendid isolation. Bismarck once said that America was the most blessed great power in history because it was geographically located in a place where its two neighbors, it was bordered on two sides by weak and friendly neighbors, and on the other two sides by fish. Israel, unfortunately, is not surrounded by enough fish. It's surrounded by enemies who've been trying to destroy it for 60 years. And that's hard for Americans to comprehend, that their lives are at stake every day. The life of the state is accepted. Milan Kundera once said, "A small country is a country that can disappear and knows it." He was speaking of his own Czechoslovakia, which in 1938 disappeared. Israel is a small country. France is not, Germany is not. They can be defeated, but they will not disappear. America is not. It takes a leap of the imagination to think of a country that can disappear, and that's where you come in and your work comes in, to make Americans understand the depth of the risk and the depth of the tragedy that awaits missteps and mistakes. And the other part of this is that Americans live in a vast continental country. They have a very hard time understanding how small Israel is. I attribute this to the evening weather report. You watch the weather in the evening and you see a map of the United States on your screen, west coast to east coast. On that same screen, 10 minutes later, is a story out of the Middle East where Israel occupies the same space from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. It is impossible to understand how tiny this land is. And one example of that I'm always impressed with is how ridiculous are the words are used to describe the geological formations in Israel. They speak of the Jordan River. You ever seen it? Rock Creek after a rain is the Mount of Olives. Americans think of Mount Rainier. It's not even a hill, it's a bump. It's a speed bump outside Jerusalem. My favorite, of course, is the Sea of Galilee. The sea, it's a pond. You could put it in Cape Cod and it would disappear. So your job is to make Americans understand the peril, the risk, and above all, the stakes. This is a people who have survived for 3,000 years. This is a people who have suffered for 2,000 years. This is a people with an undeniable, unmistakable right to this land which they are willing to share given the circumstances and the fact that others came into the land while they were exiled and expelled. This is a country, as Barbara Tuchman once said, that is the only people on earth that worships the same God, speaks the same language, and lives on the same land that it did 3,000 years ago. And our mission, our duty, our sacred obligation is to make sure that that continues for another 100 and 1,000 years ahead of us. Thank you very much.